Hello class, my name is Joseph Murray and this is my debate for why I do not think that the protests on the Capitol on January 6th were acts of domestic terrorism. I would like to start off by saying that those who did commit crimes at the Capitol should be persecuted as such. I do not want to live in a lawless society, and I would like to see those people brought to justice. However, I will also argue that the majority of people who were there in the Capitol, surrounding the Capitol, DC at the time, were not terrorists, nor were they criminals. Okay, let's get started. One of the main reasons that people levy the charge of domestic terrorism is due to the amount of lives lost at the Capitol protest, but I think this is a really dishonest tactic, and here's why. All but one of the police officers who died at the Capitol protests died because they took their own lives. Only one police officer who died did not die from suicide, and that officer, Officer Sicknick, had pre-existing conditions, brain issues, and he died of a stroke. I believe it was 3 days later. If it wasn't 3, it was 2. So we have one police officer who died from a stroke days after all the other police officers killed themselves. Moreover, multiple protesters died. However, these protesters did not die in fights. They died of drug overdoses, heart failures, things like that. Only one protester was killed through an act of violence. That was Ashley Babbitt. She was shot by, I believe it was Chuck Schumer's specific police detachment. Whoever it is, it doesn't matter. That's one person. The conclusion is not yet out as to what she did that warranted the police shooting at her. That is up for the courts to decide. Even if Ashley Babbitt was completely guilty, which I would not be surprised if she was, one person is not really warranting an entire event to be labeled domestic terrorism. Most of the protesters who died of natural causes or accidental drug overdoses. It wasn't a battlefield. Only one person died from actual acts of violence, and that was one protester. Moreover, I don't really think you can call it an act of terrorism, or domestic terrorism rather, when they were quite literally invited into the building. And I will link these videos or articles below because some people don't know this. But when the protesters were outside of the Capitol, long before they breached the Capitol police were opening the personnel guard barriers and saying, "Go on in." They were literally removing gates, opening doors, removing barricades, and letting the protesters in. There's videos of Capitol Police officers who were higher ranking literally saying, "We don't agree with why you're here, but we do respect your right to free speech. Go on in." There's instances where the Capitol Police literally set up metal detectors and were letting people funnel into the Capitol building. There was another instance where one of the officers in charge went to the people making speeches, the protesters making speeches in the Capitol, and he literally said, "You're allowed to be here so long as you stay peaceful and don't attack people." Okay, so even if the Capitol Police as a whole, the government as a whole, did not want the protesters to be there, it is a logistical failure on behalf of the government that allowed for this protest to happen inside the Capitol building. Clearly, the channel of communication from the top of the Capitol Police to the bottom was not there, given the fact that there were numerous instances of Capitol Police working with protesters to allow them to enter the building. Due to that logistical failure, I do not think it is fair to argue that it was an insurrection that sieged the Capitol and took it over. Regardless of if the legislature or the Capitol building wanted them in there, it was the police who let them in there to begin with. And it is not very fair to levy these accusations against the groups as a whole when it is a logistical failure that allowed for it to happen. So for that reason, I do not think that simply being in the building constitutes terrorism. It's just a very slippery slope to go down. And I also think that it is, as far as legal precedence goes, dangerous to start to make the argument that occupying publicly funded government buildings in a form of protest is terrorism. Because if we look at the history of like the civil rights movement, various other protests, occupying government buildings, government spaces have been instrumental in getting a lot of the freedoms that we've had now. And I think it is very dishonest to not set the same standard for both sides of the political spectrum, their protests. Because I, for one, am happy that the civil rights movement was successful. But if we're going to appreciate their right to be heard and their right to occupy buildings, sit-ins, things like that, we have to also respect the rights of people on the other side of the spectrum who are also arguing for political motives. It's a very slippery slope. I would not like to see our First Amendment rights be abridged. I do not think that the majority of people who were there committed any crimes, nor do I think it was a terrorist incursion. It is very hard to say that when logistical failures by the government themselves allowed for it to happen. For those reasons, I do not think that the protests on Capitol Hill January 6th were a domestic terrorist attack. I hope this helped, and if you disagree, feel free to let me know why. Free debates like this are how we can come to greater understandings as an entire nation. Thank you for your time, and have a good rest of your day, guys. Thanks.